Hey guys, how's it going? Hope you're doing well. My name is Crown, and today I'm going to read you some very interesting stories that I hope that you're gonna love. And now, without further ado, let's go!
My sister is the kind of person who'd rather smooth things over than rock the boat. That's probably why she's still with her husband, even though he's shown his true colors over the years. Their situation is complicated. My niece, my sister's daughter from her previous relationship, was born with severe disabilities. She needs round-the-clock care and special accommodations. My sister and her husband bought this house years ago specifically to modify it for my niece's needs. They've invested everything into making it wheelchair accessible, installing special equipment, and ensuring my niece has the best quality of life possible. My sister works full-time while also being a caregiver when she's home. Between her job caring for my niece and managing the household, she barely has time to breathe. And her husband. Well, let's just say he's shown his true nature over time. I started noticing it during my visits. He'd wait until my sister was busy with my niece, then he'd start his little performances. He would start complaining about immigrants taking jobs in our country. I would calmly sip my tea and sarcastically ask him to elaborate on how people seeking a better life were such a problem. He'd get worked up ranting about how immigrants were everywhere, in hospitals, construction sites, and schools. I'd respond by pointing out that these people were working as doctors, building houses, and teaching children, saying it with clear sarcasm. He'd always get this smug look on his face when trying to bait me. I'm a small woman, but I've never been afraid to stand up to anyone. Back at our local pub, I've faced down men twice my size who were spouting racist nonsense. My brother-in-law knew this, which is why he only pulled this act when I was stuck at their house helping with my niece or my sister. One day, while my sister was upstairs tending to my niece who had caught a nasty flu, he started up again. He started ranting about news reports of boats crossing the channel, claiming they were all coming for benefits. I just gave him a stone-faced silence. He then complained about people being too sensitive these days and unable to take jokes. This went on for years. Then one evening during dinner they started talking about their retirement plans. My sister excitedly described a lovely coastal town in Spain they were looking at. My brother-in-law chimed in about the beautiful weather and friendly people, dreaming about their nice life there. That's when the bomb dropped. My sister carefully brought up the topic of financial planning, asking about his pension plan. He uncomfortably admitted he only had the state pension. My sister's face fell. The silence in the room was deafening. I asked if this meant he'd need to work in Spain. He reluctantly admitted he'd probably need to work part-time at least. That's when I pointed out the irony that he would be an immigrant taking someone's job. The color drained from his face. His mouth opened and closed like a fish out of water. He stood up so quickly his chair scraped loudly against the floor, and he walked out to the garden without a word. But I wasn't done. After the United Kingdom voted to leave the European Union, making it much harder for British citizens to work in European Union countries, I couldn't resist one final dig. I pointed out that at least now he wouldn't have to worry about stealing a job from a Spanish person, given his strong views on immigrants taking local jobs. He turned purple with rage and stormed out of the room. My sister later told me he spent the entire evening researching visa requirements for non-European Union citizens in Spain, only to discover how difficult and expensive it would be. These days, he's oddly quiet about immigration whenever I visit. Instead, he mutters under his breath about unfair visa requirements and discriminatory work permit policies. The irony seems lost on him, but watching him squirm every time Spain comes up in conversation makes my visits much more bearable. Last I heard, they've had to postpone their retirement plans indefinitely. I work as an emergency room nurse, and that particular morning I was heading home after pulling a grueling 16-hour shift. We'd been short-staffed due to a nasty flu outbreak that had taken down 3 of our regular nurses, so I'd volunteered to cover extra hours. I was exhausted, running on nothing but stale coffee and pure willpower. The subway platform was relatively quiet that morning, with just a handful of early commuters waiting for the 6 a.m. train. I was standing there mentally calculating how many hours of sleep I could get before my next shift when I heard the commotion. An elderly lady, probably in her mid-70s, had accidentally stumbled while trying to reach a bench. She barely grazed this well-dressed woman in her 40s who immediately started screaming as if she'd been assaulted. The woman began yelling at the elderly lady about her expensive outfit and called her a senile old bat. The elderly lady was mortified, trying to apologize profusely while struggling to regain her balance. She stammered out an apology and asked if the woman was all right. This only made things worse. The angry woman started screaming even louder, accusing the elderly lady of damaging her jacket and suggesting she'd done it on purpose, saying old people think they can get away with anything. The elderly lady was on the verge of tears, and I could see her hands trembling as she clutched her walking cane. After 16 hours of dealing with genuine emergencies and life-or-death situations, I had zero patience for this kind of entitled behavior. I shouted at her to shut up, pointing out that her precious jacket didn't have a single mark on it, and told her to leave the elderly lady alone. The woman turned to me. I've seen that look before in the emergency room, the kind of irrational anger that makes people do stupid things. She started screaming at me, demanding to know if I knew who she was. I shot back that I didn't care if she was the Queen of England, telling her she was bullying an elderly person who had already apologized for an accident and needed to get over herself. That's when things went from bad to worse. She stormed toward me. I thought she was just going to yell in my face, but suddenly she lunged at me with both hands. I felt her pushing me with surprising force, and before I knew it, I was teetering on the edge of the platform. Time seemed to slow down. I could hear the rumble of the approaching train, feel the wind from the tunnel, and see the horrified faces of the other commuters. Just as I was about to fall backward onto the tracks, several pairs of hands grabbed me. A construction worker and 2 other commuters had rushed forward, pulling me back to safety just as the train rushed past. The whole platform erupted in chaos. Someone had already hit the emergency button, and I could hear others calling the police. Karen tried to run, but 2 guys blocked her path to the exits. She started screaming that I had assaulted her and she was just defending herself. The construction worker called her out, telling her that everyone had witnessed her attempting to murder someone. The police arrived within minutes. There were at least a dozen witnesses, and the whole thing had been caught on the platform's security cameras. When they were putting her in handcuffs, she was still screaming about her fancy clothes and how everyone was conspiring against her. The court case was pretty straightforward. Multiple witnesses, clear security footage, and her own unhinged behavior during the arrest made it an easy conviction. She got sentenced to 15 years for attempted murder. During the trial, we found out she had a history of assault charges that had been settled out of court, mostly against service workers and elderly people. The elderly lady came to testify at the trial. Turns out she was a retired pediatric surgeon who'd saved hundreds of children's lives during her career. She insisted on taking me out for coffee afterward to thank me for standing up for her. We still meet up sometimes, and she tells me amazing stories about her time in the operating room. I've been in the tech industry for over a decade now, specializing in software development for one of those giant corporations everyone knows. You know, the kind that plasters their logo everywhere and runs commercials during the Super Bowl. I started with them 5 years ago, and initially it was great. The work was challenging, the pay was good, and best of all, I could work from home. During the pandemic, our entire team proved we could be incredibly productive remotely. We consistently met our deadlines, improved our project delivery times, and even managed to launch several major initiatives ahead of schedule. I personally received 2 promotions during this period, all while working from my home office. Then earlier this year, our new Chief Operations Officer decided to shake things up. We received a company-wide email announcing that all employees must return to the office for a minimum of 3 days per week, effective immediately. This was part of their new corporate culture initiative. The announcement was followed by a cascade of meetings with our respective managers. The problem? Our entire department had become distributed across the country. My immediate team members were spread across 4 different states, and my direct supervisor was based in another time zone entirely. When I pointed out to my supervisor that this made no sense for our team, since none of my colleagues were even in the building, he just said he understood my concern and was in the same situation himself, but that the orders came from above. I asked if this meant I'd be sitting alone in an office, doing exactly what I do at home, just with a longer commute. He confirmed this was unfortunately the case and claimed his hands were tied. I tried escalating it to my supervisor's boss. The department head just told me we all had to make sacrifices because this was about company culture. When I questioned what culture could possibly exist when I sit on an empty floor and talk to people through my laptop, exactly like I do at home, he just repeated that he understood my frustration, but the policy applied to everyone and we needed to show solidarity. For 2 months, I dragged myself to the office 3 days a week. I watched my productivity drop as I spent 2 hours each day commuting. I started feeling burnt out not from the work, but from the sheer pointlessness of it all. My electricity bill at home went down, but my gas expenses tripled. Then I decided to conduct an experiment. I simply stopped going to the office. For 3 weeks, I worked from home, attended all my meetings, completed all my projects, and guess what? Nobody noticed any difference in my work quality or output. Eventually, Human Resources sent me an email reminding me that I wasn't meeting the required in-office attendance policy and asking me to ensure compliance immediately. That's when I remembered something interesting about our attendance policy. Paid time off counted as in-office time. Over the years, I'd accumulated a substantial amount of paid time off, nearly 400 hours. I did some quick math and realized I could take 2 full days off every week through the end of 2024 and still have some time left over. So I submitted my paid time off requests, all of them. 2 days every week strategically placed to ensure I'd only need to go to the office once a week. The response was almost immediate. The department head wanted to discuss my paid time off requests, claiming this pattern wasn't sustainable for meeting our project deadlines. I simply replied that I was using my earned time off according to company policy. He suggested I consider taking half days instead to ensure project continuity. I pointed out that this wouldn't help since I'd still need to commute for half days, but mentioned I was open to discussing alternatives to the office attendance requirement. He insisted the attendance policy wasn't negotiable and that they needed me to be more flexible. I explained that I was already being flexible by arranging my paid time off around project deadlines and meeting schedules. He argued that this wasn't what they meant by flexibility and that they needed me to work with them. I maintained that I was already working with them on my working days and was simply using my earned time off on other days, as was my right according to company policy. That was just the first week. By the end of the second week, our project deadlines started slipping. Not because I wasn't doing my work, I was actually more productive on my work from home days than I ever was in the office. But the constant interruption of my schedule was causing delays. By week 3, they were in full panic mode. The department head complained that my absence was causing significant project delays and we needed to revisit the arrangement. I explained that I was meeting all my deadlines on my working days and suggested that if the current project timeline wasn't feasible with my scheduled paid time off, perhaps we should adjust the timeline. He insisted this wasn't about adjusting timelines but about my commitment to the company. I responded by stating that I was committed to delivering excellent work, which I consistently done, and I was also committed to using my earned benefits according to company policy. The situation came to a head when they escalated it to the chief operations officer himself. But here's where it gets good. He had to join the meeting remotely because he was working from home that day. He tried to argue that my use of paid time off, while technically within policy, was causing operational issues. I pointed out the irony that we were having this discussion about office attendance through a remote meeting. That actually made him pause. Then I presented my documented productivity metrics from the past 3 months, complete with graphs showing I was most productive on my work from home days. And the only disruption to projects came from the mandated office days where I sat alone in a building with none of my team members. The numbers didn't lie, the policy was actively harming productivity. 2 weeks later, they announced a pilot program for select teams to trial a more flexible work arrangement. Surprisingly, my entire department was chosen for this pilot. Now I only go to the office for the quarterly team meetings when everyone flies in, which, ironically, has led to more meaningful in-person collaboration than the previous policy ever did. I still have all that paid time off saved up though. You never know when you might need it. My husband and I moved into our dream home about 8 months ago. It's a lovely 2-story house in some neighborhood, perfect for starting a family. Everything was going great until about 2 months in, when our next-door neighbor, this grumpy old man in his mid-60s, started making our lives miserable. It began with complaints about my husband's workshop in our garage. My husband's a carpenter who occasionally works from home. And yes, power tools can be noisy, but he's always respectful of quiet hours and never works past 6 p.m. or on weekends. We even gave all our neighbors our phone numbers in case they had any concerns. The old man would stand at his window watching our house like a hawk. Whenever my husband would start working, we'd hear angry mumbling from next door. At first, we tried to be understanding. Maybe he worked nights, or perhaps he was ill and needed peace. So my husband went over to talk to him. I greeted the neighbor politely and explained that my husband wanted to discuss his concerns about the noise. The old man barely opened his door and accused my husband of doing it on purpose, claiming he was messing with him. My husband tried to explain calmly that he was just trying to make a living and always followed the neighborhood guidelines about noise. The old man cursed at us, ranting about how young people had no respect for anyone else, then slammed the door in our faces. After that, things escalated quickly. He started filing noise complaints with our homeowners association, but they were dismissed since we weren't violating any rules. He'd stand in his yard, filming my husband whenever he worked. It was getting creepy. Then came yesterday. My husband left for a client's house around 8 a.m. I was heading to my car for work about an hour later, checking my purse for my keys, when I heard rapid footsteps behind me. The old man charged at me, yelling about how I thought I was so smart letting my husband torment him every day. When I turned around startled and asked what he was talking about, he got in my face and threatened to beat my head in if my husband didn't stop his nonsense. His friend shouted from across the street telling him to get back and leave me alone, but the old man ignored him and continued threatening me, saying we would regret moving here. I managed to get into my car and immediately called the police. My hands were shaking so badly, I could barely hold the phone. 2 officers arrived within minutes. The first officer asked me to explain what happened, and I tried to keep my voice steady as I told them how he had charged at me from behind and threatened to beat my head in. The old man immediately denied everything to the officers, claiming he was just trying to talk to me, and even had the nerve to say I was the nice one. It was my husband who was the problem. When the second officer warned him that threatening people was a serious offense, the old man kept insisting he hadn't threatened anyone and that I was making it all up. His friend came forward and confirmed my story, but since the old man hadn't actually hit me, the officers said they couldn't arrest him. They did, however, file a report and warned him about making threats. When my husband got home and I told him what happened, he was furious. I've never seen him so angry. He declared he was going to teach that coward a lesson he wouldn't forget. I begged him not to, saying it wasn't worth going to jail over him. My husband was still furious, insisting that the old man couldn't get away with threatening his wife. Instead of letting my husband do something he'd regret, we called our lawyer. Our lawyer helped us file for a restraining order, and we installed security cameras all around our property. The next day, while the old man was standing in his yard, glaring at our house, a police car pulled up. But it got even better. Apparently, he had outstanding warrants in another county for harassment and making threats to previous neighbors. The officers took him away in handcuffs while he screamed about how we'd planned this all along. His friend came over later to apologize and told us the old man had been becoming increasingly paranoid over the past year, refusing to seek help despite his family's concerns. Now he's facing charges not just for threatening me, but for his previous offenses too. The police found a notebook in his house filled with times and dates he documented my husband's harassment, most of which were times when my husband wasn't even home. We still see him occasionally, but now he has to stay at least 100 feet away from us and our property. And now we have reached the end of today's stories. Thank you for watching, and see you next time.